Let's talk about perpetrators' perceptions. The perceptions of the Gukurahundi perpetrators of Ndebele civilians as an ethnic group, which is what we also call identification by others. That you are identified as belonging to a group by others. Even if they make a mistake, still genocide. Even if they mistake you for a group and they target you, they've targeted that group by mistaking you for that group. There is overwhelming evidence that at the very highest level of political and military authorities, there was a perception that the victims belonged to an ethnic group that was targeted for elimination. At the highest level, I'm repeating, from the very onset, senior government officials did not hide their view, which has been described by Stuart Doran, as a succinct conflation of the historic and demographic dimensions of the alleged Ndebele sedition. The Ndebelization of the atrocities was part of the architecture of the Gukurahundi. You know, in 1980, as early as 1980, Edison Zobo was quoted after the election. Remember that the election, ZANU won 57 seats, and then there were three others, UNC, Ndonga, and then ZAPU got 20, and then there was a protected reserved seats for the whites, the white community. And there was a pattern and an explanation as to why Matabele and ZAPU got seats in Matabele and 20 seats and nowhere else. And the answer is clear, because that election was also very violent. And the period preceding the election was extremely violent. The Zanla combatants were never encamped in the assembly points. They were deployed to the villages, and they literally emptied the villages of all ZAPU support and killed and beat people. People were killed in Highfield, in Kwekwe, all the ZAPU elements were removed. That's why, the only reason why, as an example, in Matabele and ZAPU got all the seats was because the Zanla could not come to do that in Matabele land. Because the Zipra combatants in the camps, in the assembly camps, would have come out and would have had a civil war there. So anyway, why am I saying this? Because you have to look at this from the beginning and walk with it. Walk with how it came about. In 1980, looking at the results of the election, that Matabeleland and part of Midlands, remember Joshua Nkomo got his seat in Midlands, by the way, people forget this. Zobo says, while some whites were afflicted by the withdrawal from power syndrome, on the other side of the coin, this is Zobo in 1980, some Ndebele Zimbabweans viewed Mugabe's victory as an unbearable power denial which had somehow to be reversed. You now understand the conflation of ethnicity and politics. Zobo was a very senior member of ZANU, and a key strategist. He's saying this in 1980. He's already saying all people who support ZAPU and Ndebele. 1980. And that they are unhappy that Mugabe has won before they are dissidents. So the inflammatory and incendiary government narrative parroted in the state media that Ndebele villagers had willingly chosen to aid dissidents by providing food and water, and that there was blatant cooperation rather than coercion of the poor villagers, unarmed villagers. So if you look at what was being said at the highest level, you can see this identification by others of the people of Matabeleland as Ndebele ethnic groups who support Nkomo. The support for Nkomo is incidental, but the targeting of Ndebeles is actual, because you're targeting them as Ndebeles. Your motives are irrelevant. So you may recall this, I cited in the paper as well. Donald Treford, one of the journalists for The Observer who broke this in 1984 in the height of the curfew, he interviewed Robert Mugabe, and Mugabe told him that the situation in Matabeleland is one that requires change. The people of Matabeleland must be reoriented. This was Mugabe's words. And Donald Treford responded to Mugabe saying, here one suspects the real reason for the deployment of the 5th Brigade is not so much to round up dissidents, but to re-educate the Ndebele in the reality of power. This is Donald Treford in response to Mugabe. It wasn't just Donald Treford. The South African mission, diplomatic mission, reached the same conclusion. We're talking about perception, right? Objective tests, how people perceive and how you perceive yourself. The South African mission reached the same conclusion and said, it seems that the government has decided to hold the Ndebele as a nation responsible for the dissident problem and act mercilessly against them. The United States Secretary of State, George Shultz, 1983 in March, wrote against the same and said, there are numerous reports of atrocities being perpetrated by the All Shona Brigade, including indiscriminate killings, torture, rape, beatings, and the destruction of property, including in several instances entire villages. Schultz noted that there are also reports that as many as 1,000 to 3,000 people have died. And then the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, Chester Crocker, I think he was black. He's black. I don't know if he's still alive. He wrote to the U.S. delegation visiting Zimbabwe and said, described Mugabe's policy in Matabeleland as turning the 5th Brigade loose on the Ndebele. The stigmatization of a group as a distinct national, ethnic, or racial unit by a community in the eyes of the alleged perpetrators has been elaborated in the case of Jelicic in the International Criminal Court for Yugoslavia, in the International Tribunal for Yugoslavia, Criminal Tribunal. So I've already described here how there were different perspectives by diplomats, by perpetrators. I go into deeper detail, including by the commander of the Gukurahundi, the 5th Brigade, how he himself was clear in his words. Nkomo, let me cite Nkomo at the time. Who argued that the 5th Brigade had been formed outside the structure so that it could be used as a party and tribal brigade for eliminating and liquidating, as you have said many times, he was talking to Mugabe, those you choose to destroy, the ZAPU party structure and those who supported it, who were said to be sustaining dissidents. We must not lose sight of the fact that there's a huge tribal element to this. I'm happy to pause here because I think I've been talking for a while. I can keep going. There's more I need to say about this, including instances of where the perpetrators themselves. Remember, I've talked about from an objective test. A subjective test is how you are perceived and how you perceive yourself. I still have to talk about how victims themselves considered themselves. So, and there are many other explanations. There are many other examples. You know, the deliberate segregation, for example, and exclusion of Shona speakers from attacks and mass killings. You know, This by perpetrators demonstrated an intent to destroy a specific group, because if people were in a bus and the bus was stopped in a roadblock, people were asked to produce their IDs. If they were a particular surname, if they were Ndebele, the name was Ndebele, they would be put aside, they would be beaten, some of them would be taken away and they would be killed and disappeared. But if they were a different surname, they would be spared. Even Lieutenant Colonel Dyke was very clear, about his intent. He spoke about how there was he acknowledged the targeting of Ndebeles as a deliberate military strategy, and of course, many others. And Dyke actually said the Ndebeles were well aware of the strategy, and I can keep going. The acting commissioner of police, Harry Mukurajija, who said at the time, this is not a political matter, but a tribal matter, that the Ndebele must be crushed. This is Harry Mukurajija, who was commissioner. You then have, obviously, writings, an interview by Katri Yap. He did a brilliant thesis on this. Interviewed Munemo, Colonel Munemo, who was the Gukurahundi commander. And Munemo actually confirms this. He says, the campaign against the Ndebele civilian population was an integral part of the army orders. It was an integral part. The conflation of Zapu and Ndebele was evident from the onset. So Munemo says ethnicity was central when he talks to Katriap, quoted by Katriap in an interview. And he says the operations on the ground were simply ethnic. This is Munemo himself. And Munemo says that when a victim identified themselves as Shona, it led to identity confusion and to the 5th Brigade soldiers losing their steam to hate. This stark revelation by the 5th Brigade commander puts the issue of genocidal intent beyond doubt. It puts the issue of perpetrator perception of the ethnicity of the members of the group beyond question. I'll stop there and pause. Hello. Should I continue? I think, Riazo, please mute your mic. Hello. I know the child wants to learn about Gukurahundi as well, but we have to catch them while they are young. So I will explain. Some of what I've said also is indicative and useful for unpacking the other element of genocidal intent. I've already spoken about this in the highlights. I will go down. Let's talk about the victim perceptions. Victim perceptions of belonging to the Ndebele ethnic group. This is self-identification. Let's look at the facts on the ground and the evidence. Many of the victims and survivors of Gukurahundi have reported that the atrocities were connected to an ethnic narrative and an agenda. Victims themselves talk about how the perpetrators made no secret of this underlying motive. In other instances, perpetrators referred to their supremacy, Shona supremacy. In other instances, victims report that in all instances, villagers were gathered and addressed in Shona language, not always, but sometimes through interpreters. And they talk about how victims were forced to sing songs in Shona all night and beaten if they failed to do so. Villagers who were unable to understand or respond to Shona were targeted for killing or severe beatings. In all instances, victims talk about the targeting of victims who are unable to respond or speak in Shona. And those who were able to respond and speak in Shona were spared and told to go home. There are countless, dozens of instances where victims describe this. The segregation. The Ndebele civilian population perceives that it was chosen and targeted by perpetrators on account of his ethnic identity. There's not even one single person I've met that doesn't believe this. So in this particular case, both the objective and the subjective tests for establishing a protected ethnic group in terms of the convention are met. We have victims who consider themselves as Ndebele, who consider themselves as having been targeted because they're Ndebele. We have perpetrators who consider the victims as Ndebele, who targeted them for being Ndebele. We have other actors, diplomats. We have architects, politicians, military people who perceive this group as distinct, as a distinct ethnic group. I will stop here. I'm not so sure how we're doing for time, because I have a feeling that we could go on all day. What was next for me was going to be a discussion of the intent, the requirement for special intent. Remember I said there's three elements: protected group, special intent, and the commission of one of the acts. Those are the three for genocide. We've just finished the protected group by explaining to what extent and in what way the Ndebelés constitute an ethnic group as envisaged by the Genocide Convention. So now, with your permission, I'm happy to continue. I know it's May Day. I know that the unemployment rate in Zimbabwe is very high, so not many people have jobs, but I know people have livelihoods and they earn income in so many other ways. So I don't assume that everybody's on holiday. And even if they were, I assume people want to spend time with their families too. So, with your permission, I can go to special intent, unless you want me to take some questions. Okay, I understand that we are going to pause here. We would like to hear perspectives of victims, which are going to be played now. Our panelist was not able to join us, if I understand it. I just thank you so much, Sam, for this. So I will pause, and then I will afterwards go back to discuss special intent, which is the second requirement. Thank you. I'll put my mic on mute for now. Thank you. Samge, over to you. While you are getting this sorted, there's one thing I forgot to mention in terms of perpetrator perception. I guess the most definitive confirmation that Ndebele were targeted from the horse's mouth himself. Mugabe was asked when he was at the Blue Roof and he was so sorry for himself after he had been removed in the coup. He was asked about Gukurahundi. Are you sorry about it at all? Do you have any regrets? This is in 2017, I can't remember, 2017 or 2018. And Mugabe answered the question beyond any doubt. He said, yes, it was unfortunate what happened, but that Ndebele party was trying to overthrow the government. So there you have it. Mugabe himself, from his own mouth, 35, 36 years later, still believes he was justified and still believes that ZAPU was a Ndebele party, which of course is rubbish. those of you who know ZAPU and the history of ZAPU was anything but a Ndebele party. Nkomo Parenyata was one of Nkomo's deputies before he died at Hini Junction. Nyandoro, Chikerema, Msikavanu. Msika is not Msika, is Msikavanu. What people don't understand. And Msika was Nkomo's deputy for how many years? ZAPU was never in Ndebele party. If there was a party that was not Ndebele, it was ZAPU. But Mugabe chose to label it in Ndebele party so that he could target the Matebeles, the Ndebeles, who he felt supported ZAPU and will continue to be loyal. So he manufactured this, and he admitted it himself. I mean, it's there, the clips are there, the videos are there. He was asked a question, I think, by SABC or by our friends at the Independent at the time. I think Sanim there would have been one of them, or Kolwani or somebody. I can't remember the team that went to see him there at the Blue Roof. And he admitted it, that it was a Ndebele party. So we don't even have to go very far. At the top, at the highest level of architects, this was a genocide by their own terms anyway. I'll pause and I'll hand over, I think, to Bege to play the clip from Adlamin. If it's not working, I'll continue, and then you nudge me when you're able to get it together, so that we just make continuous use of the time we have. Okay, I think...
okay, Malunga, maybe can I come in there?
Yes, please come in, Zala.
Yeah, perhaps maybe we can look at the aspect of what you are raising are the aspects of international law in relation to defining a genocide and what constitutes a genocide and what are the consequences of that from an international law perspective. And as you unpack Gukurahundi, putting it within that context, I'm not sure if later on you are going to then look at it from a domestic point of view as well, in light of the Genocide Act of 2000, which then says they accept the international definition of genocide. Our government has accepted all those definitions and all those terms to say a genocide is constituted in the following manner, which is in line with the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. But then our Act says this only applies from the date of the commencement of the Act, which is, this is Act number 9 of 2000. And when we talk of Gukurahundi, we are talking of something that happened in the 1980s, meaning that it is not covered by our own domestic laws, even though they acknowledge Gukurahundi as even though they acknowledge that a crime of genocide can be perpetrated and should be punished in terms of the provisions of that act. So how do we marry the two? How do we reconcile our act and the international law vis-a-vis the incidents that we are discussing today that only happened in the 1980s?
That's a great question, Mzala. Yeah, I've read the Genocide Act of 2000. That's why I always say I'm shocked at the lawyers that advised the government to pass that law. But of course, I think they thought they were clever, because they thought that if they pass the Genocide Act and then they include exceptions to its applicability, including the exception, what they call in law, nulla crime sine lege, which is you cannot You cannot charge somebody of a crime that was not a crime at the time that they committed it. So they felt that by the time the act came into place, because the Gukurahundi had happened before, it wouldn't apply. So an act cannot apply retrospectively. Literally, the law says there's no retroactive application of law, especially criminal law. That's a principle of law. But you see, that's not the end of the story. That was the intention. The intention was to exclude the applicability of the Genocide Act to Gukurahundi. But what the framers of that law didn't reckon with is that at the time the Gukurahundi was committed in 1982 to 87, genocide was already an international crime. Genocide was already an international crime, I repeat. Genocide did not become an international crime by the enactment of the Genocide Act in 2000. The Genocide Act was implementation of the Genocide Convention's ratification by the Zimbabwean government, which it had done in 1983, I think, or so. So the bottom line is this. At the time that genocide was committed in Matabeleland, genocide was already part of customary international law. It was already a crime to commit genocide. Whether there's an act or not is irrelevant. So even if Zimbabwe didn't have a genocide act to exclude Gukurahundi, the crimes will still be crimes. The act cannot unmake the criminal conduct of Gukurahundi as a genocide. I hope it's clear, Tom, but that's not
it is clear, but people will always raise this argument, like you are saying. Clever lawyers will be saying, no, we acknowledge that you can say all you can say about Gukurahundi, but our Genocide Act doesn't apply. We have ratified the convention, and in terms of our domestic laws, what you are considering a crime doesn't exist in terms of our law. It's not applicable at all. So you are bringing in the dimension to say, yes, this genocide has been a crime since as far back as 1946, I think, when the convention was signed by the General Assembly of the UN to make genocide a crime. So you are saying, even if there is no domestic law to deal with it, there is still that international law aspect that remains alive, that remains applicable. Then the question maybe to an ordinary listener right now would be, is there a possibility that perhaps a crime expires over time, or there is a time frame within which certain crimes under international law should be prosecuted, or a crime remains alive in perpetuity until it is prosecuted?
That's a brilliant question, because that question is the next question in this particular case. So you are right. And it's an important protection of people or civilians or citizens in any country to say that you cannot be charged for something that was not a crime at the time you committed it, right? It's because otherwise people would make things that you do criminal. They would say what you've done is now a crime, and then they would. So so we must think. Well, we must not take it lightly. However, there's also another very important legal principle that international crimes are not subject to that rule of retroactive application. Anyway, you know the principle, Tom. I hate Latin. I hate using Latin words. I try to write as simply and explain as simply as possible so that most people can understand. I don't like the Latinization of law. But the point is this. This principle is important. It exists. You cannot charge somebody of a crime that was something that was not a crime at the time they committed it. However, what I'm saying is, for international crimes, that rule does not apply. So you can't say, I've passed a law in Zimbabwe to make crimes against humanity legal when they were already an international crime. I'm trying to explain as simply as possible. So yes, you're right. Clever lawyers will try and argue, but we are all clever lawyers, right? Every lawyer is clever in their own way. But the whole point is, what is the proper interpretation? Should the matter get to that point? Because we must also accept that there's a political reality that in spite of having a genocide act in Zimbabwe, the likelihood of having any genocide prosecution is zero to slim under the current disposition. But the point is this, though. There's also other exceptional measures in the act that seek to actually protect, perpetrators of Gukurahundi then from the act, the Genocide Act of 2000. One of them is this. One of them is that you cannot prosecute genocide in Zimbabwe at all without the permission of the Attorney General. That's one of the, it's inserted in the Genocide Act. So you can see why. Who's Attorney General? To whom does the Attorney General report? It's in the Genocide Act. In addition to the fact that the Act only applies to things that happened after. The other exception is that there are prescriptions of penalties that genocide, the crime of genocide is, the liability in terms of sentence and punishment is the same as the crime of murder. And I can't remember what the other exceptions are. So there's all sorts of little things that have been put there, little landmines, so that if you are going in this direction, it will explode in front of you. But the long and the short is that, in my opinion, the Genocide Act, in terms and this has happened in Argentina, where the government had put in all these exceptions, but the Constitutional Court, at a different point in a different time, ruled them unconstitutional and unlawful.
Oh, okay. No, thank you so much, Dr. Malunga. We'll try and open, maybe let's give 4 people or so to just briefly ask questions or comment, and then you can continue from where you left, so that we don't become monotonous and people get... Rieto, can you come in? And Rieto, you are not audible at all. Try to... Yeah, now I can hear you. Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Zala and Sipo. Sipo, you have succinctly described the ethnicity component of the genocide. And having listened to you, my comment rather is the use of the word in terminology itself doesn't mix a sort of contradict in some way.
I'm sorry, I'm struggling to hear the question. I'm struggling to hear.
Yeah. Rieto, maybe you can get out and try to come back again. Yeah, we can't hear you. You keep on going down and up. Are you driving or something?
No, I'm seated.
Yeah, there is noise in the background, unfortunately. Maybe check your device, you'll come back again. Let's get this up to SG. Anton Tweety.
Yeah, my question is here. Considering the Genocide Act of Zimbabwe and the simple denial of by ZANU, the ZANU government, that Gukurahundi is a genocide, are there aspects or crimes within the Gukurahundi era that we can take to court and push for prosecution and people be held liable outside the framework of calling it a genocide? Are there easy victories? Can we identify a certain crime if there's evidence of source to say, Uzbani Sambona, we abduct Tuban, there's witnesses, there's evidence? Is there a way of doing that? Yes, abantu babochiswe civilly, personally liable, number one. Number two, if we also try and pursue a prosecution of individuals over Gukurahundi crimes outside the ambit of a genocide, asiyehlisi yini izinga lobuhlungu or the extent and the magnitude of the crime? Ngiyabonga, angazi umbumbuzo wamezwa, but that's what I want to ask. Ngiyabonga.
Okay, thank you, Uncle Mtiti. But what I can point out to you is, remember that amnesty that was given towards the Unity Accord, that's the first response to any aspect of crimes related to what happened between 1982 and 1987. There was a general amnesty, remember, that was given to say anyone who did what during that period, they've been pardoned. There was that pardon that was given, whether you are an alleged perpetrator or an alleged dissident. So there was that aspect as well to prevent those types of prosecutions from happening. Maybe Malunga can add on that. I haven't done thorough research on this, but I'm aware of that general amnesty that was given by the government in 1987, I believe. Malunga?
Let me come in. So the starting point, Tulisi, thank you. That's a great question. So the point fundamentally is this. So genocide as a crime, an international crime, does not expire. It doesn't. So any alibodi genocide. International crimes are our board. International crimes don't expire. They don't have a time frame. They don't. So 10, 15, 20, 30 years. However, domestic crimes do expire. In Zimbabwe, all crimes expire after 20 years. The only crime that does not expire is called prescription. In Zimbabwe, the only crime that does not expire or prescribe is murder. So you can be held, you can be prosecuted for a murder that you committed 50 years ago. But once 20 years hits, most of us. So I would say without any doubt that all the Gukurahundi crimes except murder are still liable, are no longer liable for prosecution under Zimbabwean law. But then again, genocide is not Zimbabwean law; it's international law. So that's the answer I would like to give. As to whether the perpetrators can ever be held to account in Zimbabwe, yes, absolutely. The only question is that right now the perpetrators are in charge of the judiciary, they're in charge of everything, they're in charge of the army, they're in charge of everything. So under the current circumstances, it's not possible. And I hope that at least they use the opportunity that they have to be in power to address and resolve Gukurahundi, so that there may never ever be a need, should they ever not be in power, to be prosecuted. And there are many other ways that people can address these things beyond prosecution, even though my own conclusion as a lawyer is that the conduct is prosecutable completely.